Hello and welcome to Math 251, Calculus 1 here at Cañada College. My name is Lapuz and I'm the instructor for the course. In this video, we will take a look at an overview for section 1.2, the basic classes of functions. In this section, what we're going to do is we're going to review some of the basic ideas behind some of the basic functions. And the very first function we should know of is the linear function. So when we have a linear function, we're actually looking at lines, and when we're looking at lines, we're looking at horizontal lines or lines with some sort of an incline or slope. And it should be familiar to us that the slope for our linear functions would be looking at the rise over run. So that's the difference in the y's divided by the difference in the x's. And once you get that, you can find your equation of the line either through the point slope equation or the slope intercept form. And once you get these, you can write it in standard form. We should be flexible in writing the different forms of the lines depending on what might be needed for the situation. After looking at lines, we're going to look at the basic power functions where the power is a positive integer, and we have things like x squared, x to the fourth, etc., and we combine all those different power functions and we get a polynomial. Our basic the line is a polynomial also. The next step beyond the line is a second degree or something that's raised to the second power polynomial. And with that, we get a quadratic function. And one of the drills for us in this section is to find the roots. And we find the roots by setting your functions equal to 0. So setting the quadratic function equal to 0, we get to use our quadratic formula. And I hope you remember that. There's also formulas for the quintic and quartic functions, or cubic functions, but they get a little bit more complicated. So the quadratic formula is probably all what we're going to need for our purposes. After looking at power functions and polynomials, we're going to take a look at where the powers might be a fraction or might even be negative. And so we get roots, we get rational functions, and it turns out that these functions, if you build them up as roots and rationals, polynomials, they have a special name to them. They're called algebraic functions. Not in this section, but in the next section when we start studying trigonometry, and in the section after with exponentials and logarithmic functions, we're going to get introduced to what's called the transcendental functions. And those functions involve these things that are not algebraic. So algebraic functions, we want to think of those functions as something that where you have the fraction, the fractional, or when you have your variable and you're adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing, taking roots, or anything like that. Those are all algebraic functions. When you go beyond that, looking at logarithms, trig functions, they become transcendental functions. And then finally, we're in this particular section, we're going to take a look at, get introduced to or reacquainted with the transformations of graphs. So adding a number for the whole function gives a vertical shift of up and down depending if it's positive or negative. Adding a constant next to the x in the variables would cause a horizontal shift, left or right. Multiplying the function by a variable will stretch it or compress it, depending if it's bigger than 1 or less than 1. Multiplying the variable itself by a function will stretch it or compress it horizontally. And putting a negative sign outside of the function will reflect it about the x-axis, and putting a negative sign in the variable would reflect it about the y-axis. So hopefully these transformations are familiar, you're kind of comfortable with them, and we're just kind of reviewing them. So So that's it. This is our overview of section 1.2. Good luck.